The story of Rorkes Drift is of 150 British soldiers who for almost 10 hours held out against repeated Zulu charges during the siege or the Battle of Rorkes Drift from the 22nd to the 23rd of January 1879, where the British Empire faced off against the warriors of the Zulu Kingdom. Now, South Africa in 1879 was a mismatch of different nations, the largest being the British Cape Colony, as well as two Boer republics in the north, and the rising Zulu Kingdom, which had risen under Shaka Zulu in the previous century. Now, the Boers, who were these descendants of the Dutch settlers, were often fighting with the Zulus during this time, and especially around the 1880s or the 1879 was between the Blood River area, where they claimed land that had been granted to them by the Zulu king Dingane, although the Zulus refused this, and so there was conflict. Now, one of these Boer republics was in the north and was rather poor. It was called the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek, although the British called it Transvaal. And during this time they had lots of internal conflict as well as a border conflict with the other large Boer republic, the Oranje Vrystaat. And so in 1877 the British decided to annex the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek. The next step for the British to fully federalise South Africa, as they were doing in Canada at the same time, was to deal with the independent Zulu Kingdom to the southeast, which would then allow them to create a federation in South Africa. But of course the Zulus very much enjoyed having their own freedom, so the British sent them an ultimatum with ridiculous demands that they knew they could never comply to, and indeed the Zulus only complied to two of the somewhat like 10-15 demands that they set, and so the British decided to invade Zululand with several different columns. Of course, they were very confident of victory, as they had highly superior technology to the Zulus and thought that an indigenous foe would be easily enough to defeated. However, the Zulus were to prove them decisively wrong at their first engagement at the Battle of Isandlwana on the 22nd of January 1879. This being because although they had much inferior technology to the British of course using firearms while the Zulus were using short spears and shields made of oxenhide, actually managed to envelop the British position by using the horns of the buffalo, where they sent two flanking troops around while the loins of the buffalo, so the first line to go forward, soaked up the British fire. This resulted in some 1,300 British casualties and remains to this day the costliest defeat in British military history against an indigenous foe. And of course the Zulus were technologically, although perhaps not tactically, far inferior to the British, and this really sent shockwaves through the British Empire, which had been believed to be almost undefeatable, especially by a native foe like the Zulus. One of these columns that had been sent in and was actually left behind by the main army that went to Isandlwana was left behind at a missionary post on the Buffalo River at a place called Rorkes Drift, which had been set up by Swedish missionaries earlier in the century. And now they were of course out only 6 miles away from the battlefield of Isandlwana, and the Zulus knew that they were there. And of course, here at Rorkes Drift would be the second major engagement of the Anglo-Zulu War following the catastrophe of Isandlwana. So the British forces left behind there were a total of 152 soldiers. 141 were British regulars and 11 were colonial troops. I believe there were one or two Boers there. I know there was a Swissman there, as well as a few Swedes. And there were 100 native Natal horsemen, who I believe were led by a Colonel Henderson. Now, the Zulu forces that came to attack Rorkes Drift on the river were a total of around 3,000 to 4,000 men. And a few of these would have had firearms, although of course they were not trained in them. Many of them would have taken them from the bodies of the British they'd killed at Isandlwana, and most of them were out of date and old, and so they weren't really as well drilled as the British, although they did have them. Although the majority of Zulus, as I already said, would be armed with the short spear called the assegai, and the shields made of oxenhide, cowhide, and they would fight in the traditional manner, as well as using throwing spears and things like that. So this is a map of Rorkes Drift, and actually what the British did to defend themselves against this Zulu attack that they knew would come in a melee style, rather than the traditional European style of just shooting at each other from not very far away, was to construct sandbags around the area. And they did this with a huge wall called the Meatley Bag Wall, to protect the soldiers on the inside. Now, as well as this, they also created an inner wall called the Biscuit Bag Wall and a redoubt, which is sort of this circular formation of sandbags for in case they needed to retreat from the larger part of the Meatley Bag Wall at the end of the battle. Now, behind this wall, the British soldiers and their allies waited for the Zulu attack to come, which it soon did around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, the first Zulu attack actually swung around the south wall and then slammed into the north wall around the hospital, where the British obviously had troops stationed, so this again was some kind of Zulu decoy. And actually at this first stage of the Zulu battle, the Zulus discovered that the sandbag wall that the British had constructed was too high for them to get over. Obviously they had to get over the wall so that they could use their assegai, their spears, on the British, because they were a melee kind of attack rather than the ranged attack of the British. But this was too high, so what they started to do was to climb over the bodies of their own dead, obviously to try and poke through the wall, and to sit underneath the wall and try to grab the rifles of the British, as well as to fire up if they had firearms and kill the British. And actually quite a few of the British casualties during the war, during the Battle of Rorkes Drift, were from these firearms by the Zulus who were crouching underneath the wall to attack them. But ultimately this first attack was successfully repulsed by the British behind the sandbags. And now actually a second attack also came, and this was much more around the western edge of the defences, and this attack was much harder to repel for the British, and actually they then gave the order to retreat from the outer bag of the melee bag wall and into this second line of defence that they had constructed. Obviously this was a much smaller area to defend, so they could have many more rifles over a much smaller area, and so it would be a lot harder for the Zulus to storm. However, in doing this, although this was a fighting retreat and it was successful that the men were able to get into their new positions, this did mean that the hospital was now isolated, and there were several wounded men from Isandlwana who had escaped in the hospital, and this led to a very valiant defence of this hospital. And actually 9 out of the 11 men who were trapped inside the hospital were able to fight their way out and rejoin the others, as is depicted in the film Zulu, as many of the events here are, and Zulu is actually quite an accurate representation of what went on at the battle, if you're interested. Now, this then led to the final Zulu attack, both coming from the eastern side, or the western side, sorry, as the Zulus had come over the melee bag wall and attacked this second line, this biscuit bag wall that the British had constructed, as well as through the cattle kraal, the kraal being this word for the kind of enclosure that they had for cattle in South Africa, and the Zulus attacked from both sides. But the British, thanks to their concentration of rifle fire, I think they went down from about 20,000 rounds to 900 rounds during this time, so they came really close to being out of ammunition. They kept up a volley fire, and this ultimately was able to repel the Zulu attack as they kept coming. And actually the Zulus kept attacking through the night as well, so the British were fighting, standing in their positions, fighting for hours and hours, and it seemed that the Zulus would keep attacking until the British ran out of ammunition. But there also came an end to the Zulu desire to carry on the fight, and actually they did retreat in the morning hours at around dawn, and so the British finally got a rest after about 10 hours of fighting. And it's because of this that 11 Victoria Crosses were handed out to people at Rorkes Drift, and obviously out of 150 soldiers, 11 is a huge amount. Victoria Cross was a massive honour, although it's possible that this was only to compensate for the terrible defeat of the British force at Isandlwana. Of course, this came, it was on the same day as the Battle of Isandlwana and into the next day, the 23rd of January, so it's possible that they wanted to essentially bolster the victory at Rorkes Drift to compensate for their loss, although it goes without saying that the valiant defence of Rorkes Drift by the British soldiers and the very brave attack of the Zulu warriors, who of course were charging in with essentially Stone Age weapons while the British were firing modern firearm technology, both shouldn't be forgotten and are in their own right very impressive as a last stand, and I think we should remember everyone who fought at the Battle of Rorkes Drift. Alright everyone, so thank you very much for watching. This has been my video about the Battle of Rorkes Drift, telling the Sabaton story of Rorkes Drift and what went on there. Now I would like to say that I have actually done a collaboration with Armchair Historian, so if you're interested in the Zulu War and more stuff about that, then go and check him out. I'll have cards at various points in the video, as well as links in the description. He has made a 2-part series about the Anglo-Zulu War, which goes into more of the Prelude as well as the actual war itself, and I do actually have a video which I made in collaboration with him on the earlier history of South Africa, if you'd like to know more about the Boers and the Zulus and the Xhosa and the British in South Africa, and all of that. Thanks again to the Patreons for helping me out and to make this video. I hope you have enjoyed this. Don't forget to vote in the poll, and I will see you all very soon. Thank you for watching. I've been History with Hilbert.